My short 10-minute talk is on sample source oscillators and digital synthesis, and why digital synthesis in general moves us closer to the goals of musical synthesis. The talk is about musical synthesis as opposed to other applications of digital synthesis. I'll talk a little bit about sound shaping using subtractive synthesis and granular synthesis, and some of the advantages that digital synthesis has over analog synthesis. The talk is rated LM for a little math that's included. So when we get to that part, just turn away from the presentation if you need. Musical synthesizers come in many shapes and forms, and they generate sounds in many different ways. We have analog modules with cables, knobs, and switches with no keyboard attached. We have hardwired analog keyboard-based synthesizers with switches, buttons, and knobs. We also have virtual software synths that have no hardware components at all. We have digital synths that provide a platform for virtual software synths, and we have hybrid synths that mix and match all of those features. Some synthesizers use oscillators to generate sounds based on square waves, triangle waves, pulse waves, and sine waves. Some synthesizers use mathematical algorithms and models to generate digital representations of these sounds. Some synthesizers take audio snapshots and present picture-perfect renditions of the sound. Regardless of the type of musical synthesizers, all have a few things in common. They are first and foremost trying to emulate or reproduce some kind of acoustic musical instrument or musical principle. And secondly, they provide a palette for musicians to extend the musical vocabulary by introducing new kinds of sounds and musical possibilities. Just to set the record straight, the analog synthesizer didn't gain wide acceptance until Wendy Carlos demonstrated that a Moog synthesizer could be used to emulate the melodies, harmonies, and timbres found in classical music in her Switched On Bach album that was released in 1968 that featured music by Johann Sebastian Bach. Sure, there were experimental music at the time, but the synthesizer only gained wide acceptance from the emulation of acoustic musical instruments and sounds. It is a fact that analog synthesizers were used to emulate and reproduce acoustic music sounds, and digital synthesizers were invented to improve upon and deal with the shortcoming of analog synthesizers. All analog synthesizers and their digital versions will have four basic components: oscillators, which are the component that generates the sound or the sound source; filters, which are used to shape, carve, and manipulate the harmonic spectrum and overtone; modulators, that are used to manipulate and shape timbre and tone over time; and the amplifier, which presents the audible sound. The primary difference between analog and digital synthesizers is that on analog synthesizers, these four components are voltage controlled. Direct current is converted to alternate current that causes resistors and capacitors to cause an oscillator to vibrate and ultimately produce sound. In digital synthesizers, these components are controlled by a DSP, or digital signal processor. The DSP are usually microprocessors that ultimately produce the sound. So the primary difference is voltage control components versus DSP control components. And of course, there are hybrid synthesizers that mix voltage-controlled and DSP-controlled components. Now let's say on our modular synth, or our Moog, or our Prophet 5, we have nice, fat, warm, smooth, silky analog sounds that all fall in the audible range of 20 Hz to 20 kHz. That's a very good thing, because as it turns out, that's exactly the range of human hearing. We can't hear sounds under 20 Hz, and we can't hear sounds over 20 kHz. So we could hear the fat and warm sounds of our nice synths. The question is, when audio snapshots are used to sample those fat, warm, smooth, silky analog sounds, do the snapshots sound the same to the listener? Do they still sound just as fat and smooth? Well, at first, the audio snapshots were not up to the task. 8-bit, 24 kHz sampling rate frequencies just didn't cut it. In the early 80s, landmark groundbreaking digital synths like Fairlight and Emu 2 used 8-bit 24 Hz sampling, By the mid-80s, audio snapshot sampling rate frequencies had graduated to 8-bit 32 kilohertz, still not good enough. It was that first impression of audio snapshots and sampling during the 80s that created the narrative that digital synthesis can never sound as fat, warm, or smooth as the silky analog synthesizers. And you know what they say about first impressions. But with the 16-bit 44.1 kilohertz sampling rates and more powerful DSPs, all that has changed. Now, contrary to the urban legends and long-held beliefs stemming from the 80s, digital synthesis can totally model, reproduce, sample, and emulate any analog synthesizer. The next slide is what gives this talk an LM rating. For those that need to turn away, now is the time. A sampler or audio snapshot function that has a Nyquist rate of twice the bandwidth of our fat, warm, smooth analog sounds, in this case a bandwidth of 20 Hz to 20 kHz, and achieves a Nyquist frequency that is 1/2 the sample frequency rate, will, for all intentional purposes, be able to totally reproduce our fat and warm analog sound. And with oversampling, which is a technique that starts with the Nyquist rate and takes higher resolution snapshots in multiples of the Nyquist rate, any anomalies that do occur in the analog to digital conversion are so far outside of human hearing, feeling, and sensing range that it really doesn't matter. For example, a 64 oversampled snapshot occurs at 2,560 kilohertz. Audio snapshots and sampling at that level get rid of any aliasing or unwanted audio artifacts. So if the digital-based oscillators can produce identical waveforms as analog, what gives digital synths the advantage? Well, it all has to do with sound shaping, and digital synthesizers have a lot more of it. Subtractive and granular synthesis is to shaping sound what fingers and hands are to sculpting clay. If we look at our four primary sound shapers that analog and digital synthesizers can have in common, the oscillators, filters, modulators, and effects, these shapers are all limited by hardware restrictions in an analog synthesizer, whereas digital synthesizers have software implementations, allowing for 8, 10, 12, 24 oscillators, dozens of filters and types of filters, user-defined LFOs, user-defined multi-stage envelopes, scores of parameters per component. An analog synth would need thousands of knobs to have equivalent functionality. And it might be noted that classic analog synthesizers have no built-in effects, whereas effects are a stark part of digital synths. Digital synths simply have more sound shaping capability and more control parameters for that sound shaping capability. And at the end of the day, it's not how the original sound was generated with analog or DSP based oscillators. It's what is done with the sound and how it's shaped and controlled after it's generated. In sample-based subtractive and granular synthesis, there are four basic ingredients to shaping sound. The filter, which allows for fine precision cutting, slicing, and shaping of harmonics and overtones. The modulators, which allow changes in timbre over time by squeezing, stretching, bending, folding the sound within the panoramic audio spectrum. The effects, which allow the sound to be echoed, reverberated, phase shifted, delayed, exaggerated, muffled, brightened, vibrated, undulated, excited, compressed, and reversed. And then we have the process of slicing and dicing a sample into small grains or slices, then shuffling those grains or slices around, manipulating them, and then putting them back together into a new sample, where filters and modulators and effects can be applied to produce virtually unknown timbres. All of this is beyond the capability of analog synthesizers. After the analog waveform has been perfectly emulated in both its regularities and irregularities by the DSP and digital synthesizer, all that's really left is how the controllers can be used for articulation, dynamics, and expression, aesthetics, workflow preferences, diversity, and richness of sound shaping.